Jonathan stood motionless as the realization began to settle in the weight of it, crushing him in ways he had never thought possible. For so long, he had believed that his life was just a collection of random occurrences, small moments of insignificance that led to nothing more than the peaceful existence of a man who simply wanted to learn and understand the world around him. But now, the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, and the truth, though terrifying, was undeniable. He was not the man he had thought. He was not the man he had believed. He had been raised to be everything he had known about himself. His past, his very identity, was an illusion. Something had been hidden from him. Something far greater than anything he could have ever imagined. Something buried deep within his DNA was awakening, and he was only beginning to understand the implications of it. The more he tried to push it away, the more the memories began to flood his mind. Fragments of a life he did not remember, but knew had once been his moments of combat, of bloodshed, of battles fought on worlds that were not his home. These memories were not merely dreams or imagined scenarios. They were realities of a life lived by someone else, someone who shared his body, and yet was so much more than he had ever been trained to be a soldier. A weapon built for war. Not just any war, but wars that spanned across the galaxy, wars fought on worlds that had never been touched by human hands until now. He could feel the power growing within him with every new memory that surfaced. It was not just a mental thing. It was physical. His body was changing. It was becoming something else, something stronger, more capable of surviving the brutality of war and destruction that had once been far beyond his comprehension. The memories of these battles flooded him with every movement, every action, every breath he took. He was not Jonathan Reed, the teacher or the scholar anymore. He was something else entirely. A product of a race far more advanced than humanity. Something designed for one purpose, to be the ultimate soldier, the ultimate weapon capable of destroying anyone or anything that threatened the galaxy's peace. And now that the memories were rushing back to him in full force, he understood what he was meant to do, what he had been created to do. He had not been abandoned or forgotten by his creators. He had been left there for a reason, to evolve, to become something even more dangerous than they had originally intended. They had thought they could control him. They had thought they could isolate him and render him useless, but they had underestimated him. The time for their control was over, and the time for his awakening had come. Every part of his body felt alive with the power of his true purpose. As the memories continued to grow sharper, clearer, he could feel the strength of his training taking root within him. It was as though every skill, every technique that he had never been taught, was suddenly at his fingertips. It wasn't something he had learned through study or practice. It was something that had been hardwired into his very DNA, something that was simply waiting to be unlocked. He was no longer just a human man with a dream to study languages and explore the unknown. He was a weapon designed for survival and conquest. As the pieces of his past continued to reveal themselves, Jonathan found himself struggling to reconcile this new truth with the life he had lived up until now. Everything he had known, everything he had worked for, seemed meaningless compared to the reality of his existence. He was no longer just Jonathan Reed, no longer just a professor, a student of history. He was Subject E7 R31D, a genetically engineered soldier built for war and nothing else. The harsh truth cut deeper than any blade ever could, but there was no turning back now, no way to escape the knowledge of what he truly was. The more Jonathan embraced the truth of his existence, the more powerful he felt, but the more terrifying it became. It was as if he were being pulled in two directions. One part of him wanted to reject it, to go back to the life he had known, to cling to the humanity he had left, but the other part of him knew that part of him was already gone. That part of him was no longer who he had been, and that it never would be again. As he unlocked more and more of his memories, the power surged through him, and with each passing day, he became less and less the man he had been, and more the weapon he had been created to be, a being designed for nothing but war and survival. And as he stood there, looking at his reflection in the darkened glass, he could no longer deny the truth staring back at him. He was not Jonathan Reed anymore. He was something far more dangerous, something that had been created to change the course of history, to make the galaxy tremble at his name. He was the ultimate soldier, the weapon that had been forgotten only to now rise and claim his place in a galaxy that had no idea what was coming. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was everything he had been designed for. And as he felt the power surge within him, he knew there was no going back. No more pretending to be the man he had once been. No more hiding from what he was meant to be. His mission was clear. His purpose was set, and now there was nothing left to do but embrace it and let the world see what humanity had really created. Because Jonathan Reed was no more, and in his place stood something much greater. And the galaxy would soon learn that they had made a terrible mistake when they thought they had seen the last of him. Jonathan stood in the darkened room, the flickering light casting long shadows across the walls as he tried to process the enormity of what he was beginning to understand. The man he had always thought himself to be was a fabrication, a carefully crafted illusion designed to hide the truth of who he really was. His entire life, every thought, every aspiration had been based on lies. And now that the veil was being lifted, he could no longer deny it. He had always assumed that his memories were his own, that they were the product of his experiences, his choices, but they weren't his. They were the remnants of something far older, far more dangerous, buried deep within his DNA, planted there by those who had designed him long before he ever took his first breath. They had given him the memories of someone else, the skills of a warrior, the instincts of a soldier, all hidden beneath a surface identity that he had spent his life building. The truth, however, was unavoidable now, and as the memories surged back, he felt a deep, unsettling sense of awakening. He wasn't just Jonathan Reed, a human professor with a passion for history and language. He wasn't just a man who had dreamed of a quiet life, surrounded by books and the study of ancient texts. No, he was something far more complex, far more terrifying. He was a weapon, a product of a design so advanced that it defied human comprehension. He was a soldier, a biological instrument created to fight, to destroy, to survive in ways no ordinary human could. As the memories began to flood his mind, he could see himself, no, not him, another version of himself. A soldier in alien wars, leading battalions, commanding fleets, engaging in combat with creatures of unimaginable forms, and using weapons that transcended anything humanity had ever known. It was as though these memories were not just implanted, but had been woven into his very being. Each flash of combat, each moment of triumph, etched into the core of his existence. His body, once merely human, now responded in ways that were alien to him. Faster, stronger, more efficient, like a machine built for war. But this wasn't something he had learned in a training session or from a mentor. It was inherent, embedded in him from the very beginning, designed to surface when the time was right, and now that time had come. The purpose for which he had been created was rising within him, awakening to the surface. They, the ones who had designed him, who had left him on Earth, had thought that by isolating him, by placing him in the farthest reaches of the galaxy, they could hide him away, keep him under control, ensure that he would never become what he was capable of. But they were wrong. They had underestimated him. They had believed that humanity would never amount to anything in the grand scheme of the universe. But they didn't realize what they had truly created in Jonathan. His ability to fight wasn't just a product of training or conditioning. It was embedded in him, on a genetic level, a part of who he was, and now it was coming to life. The memories of alien wars, of battles that stretched across the stars, were rushing back to him, and with each recollection, he felt the power building inside him. His body, once weak and fragile, now felt invincible. His senses were heightened, his muscles stronger, his mind clearer than ever before. The shift was profound, as if he were becoming something more than human. something that had been designed for a singular purpose: to fight. They had left him alone, abandoned him on Earth. But now that he had begun to understand the truth, he realized that he was far from powerless. He wasn't the man who had been left behind. He was the ultimate weapon, a living tool of destruction that had been designed to outlast, outfight, and outsmart anything that came his way. The truth was terrifying, not just because of what he had been created to do, but because of what it meant for his future. He was no longer Jonathan Reed. He was Subject E7R1D, a name, a title that he had never known until now, a designation that linked him to a higher purpose that was beyond his control, the life he had known. The quiet existence he had once cherished was gone. The memories of the man he had once been were fading, slipping away as he embraced the reality of who he had been made to be. And with that reality came an undeniable truth. He could never go back. He could never be the man he had once been. His existence was now linked to the very wars he had been designed to fight, the battles that would decide not just his fate, but the fate of entire civilizations. The strength he felt growing inside him wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional, and spiritual. It was the culmination of everything he had been designed to be. The more he tapped into these memories, the more he understood that they were not just for combat. They were his guide, his way forward, the map to his true destiny. The people who had abandoned him, who had thought that isolating him on Earth would render him useless, were wrong. The more they tried to hide him, the stronger he became. And now that he understood the truth of his creation, he knew that he would rise not as a mere man, but as the weapon he had been meant to be, and nothing would stand in his way. His power was only beginning to surface, and the universe would soon realize that they had made a grave mistake when they thought they could leave him behind. Jonathan stood alone in the empty room, his mind racing with the flood of memories that were overwhelming him. Each new flash of memory seemed to pierce through the veil of his life, exposing the truth that had been buried deep within him for so long. His life, the life he thought was his, had always seemed so ordinary, so simple. He was Jonathan Reed, a man of intellect, a scholar of ancient languages and histories. He had spent his life deciphering texts and trying to unlock the secrets of civilizations long past. But now, with each passing moment, the truth was becoming clearer. He was not just a man who had stumbled upon knowledge and history. He was something far more dangerous, far more powerful. He had been created for something far greater than just research and teaching. The truth, though terrifying, was undeniable. He had been engineered for war. His body was not his own. It had been modified, enhanced, and conditioned to be a weapon, a tool of destruction designed to fight in battles that stretched beyond the confines of Earth, beyond the limits of human comprehension. And as the memories began to flood back, Jonathan began to realize the magnitude of what had been done to him. He was no longer just a human being. He was a biological weapon, a living instrument of war. The markings on his skin, the changes in his body, the rapid acceleration of his senses and reflexes, they were all evidence of the truth that he had been created for one purpose, only to fight and to survive. But there was more to it than just that. The memories of battles he had never fought, of enemies he had never faced, were all becoming vivid in his mind. These memories were not his, and yet they felt as though they belonged to him. They were the memories of a soldier, a warrior who had fought in wars across the galaxy, a soldier who had been part of something far larger than anything he could have ever imagined. Jonathan's body was remembering its true purpose, and as it did, it began to change. His muscles grew stronger, his senses sharper, his mind clearer, as though every part of him was being activated, tuned to the frequency of a warrior who had been designed to survive and fight in the most extreme conditions. But the memories were not just physical. They were also mental and emotional. As his body awakened, so did his mind. The fear, the rage, The drive to fight, to destroy, to survive were all part of him. They were a part of the program that had been implanted in his DNA, a part of his very being. Jonathan realized that he had been designed to be the ultimate soldier, the perfect weapon. But with that realization came a deep sense of horror. He was no longer just Jonathan Reed. The man he had been was gone, replaced by something else. Something that had been programmed into him from the moment he was conceived. He was no longer just a man with a dream of knowledge. He was a soldier, a weapon created to fight in a war he didn't even understand. And as the memories continued to flood back, he could feel the truth settling into his bones. He was no longer in control of his life. He had been created to follow orders, to fight, to survive, and to conquer. The people who had created him, the ones who had designed him for this purpose, had abandoned him long ago, leaving him on Earth to live a life of ignorance. They had thought that by isolating him, by leaving him alone on this planet, they could control him. They thought they could bury his true purpose, make him forget what he was created to do. But they were wrong. The awakening was inevitable. And now that he had started to remember who he was, there was no going back. Jonathan was no longer a man caught between two worlds. He was a soldier, a weapon designed for a war that he couldn't even fully comprehend. And as the full extent of his programming became clear, Jonathan began to understand that there was no place for a man like him in the world he had once known. He had been abandoned, left to live a life of falsehoods, a life of ordinary dreams when in reality he was anything but ordinary. He was a weapon, and now that weapon was waking up, ready to fulfill its purpose. The memories continued to flood his mind. The memories of battles fought on distant worlds, of victories and defeats, of comrades lost and enemies vanquished. But they weren't just memories. They were his purpose. Embedded into the very fabric of his being, Jonathan understood now that he had been created to be a tool of war, to serve a purpose far beyond anything he could have imagined. He was not just a man from Earth. He was something else, something much more dangerous. And as the full extent of his transformation became clear, Jonathan knew that his life would never be the same again. He was not the same man who had walked the earth studying languages and unraveling the mysteries of the past. That man was gone. In his place stood a soldier, a weapon, a force of destruction, and he would fulfill the purpose for which he had been created, no matter the cost. There was no going back now. There was no escaping the reality of who he was. Jonathan had been abandoned, but now that he had awakened to the truth, he would make sure that those who had created him would never forget what they had made. Jonathan stood still in the dimly lit room, his mind racing as the overwhelming flood of memories began to take root deep within him. The truth he had never known was finally coming to the surface, and with it came the realization that his life as he had known it was a lie. Everything he had believed in, everything he had been taught, had been part of a carefully constructed illusion, designed to hide the truth of who he truly was. Jonathan was not just the man he had thought he was. He wasn't just Jonathan Reed, a professor and a scholar. He was something far more dangerous, something far more powerful. He was a creation, a weapon built for war, designed to survive in the harshest conditions imaginable, created not for peace, not for knowledge, but for destruction. The more the memories flooded him, the more he could feel the power rising inside of him. Every cell, every fiber of his being was awakening to the reality of what he had been created to do. His body was no longer just a human body, it was a vessel of destruction, a tool of war. His senses were heightened, his reflexes quicker, his strength greater than anything a human could ever achieve. But it wasn't just the physical transformation that was happening within him. It was the mental one as well. The memories of battles fought on distant planets of enemies that he had fought and defeated were becoming clearer with every passing moment. It was as though his very DNA was unlocking these memories that had been hidden from him for so long, memories that had been buried deep within him, like a dormant program waiting to be activated. And now that program was waking up, Jonathan could feel the soldier inside of him, the warrior who had been created to fight, to destroy, to survive in conditions that would break any normal human being. And with every memory that surfaced, every skill that was unlocked, he knew that he was no longer just a man. He was something far more, something that had been created for a singular purpose, to be a weapon, to fight in a war that had been fought long before he ever knew of it. And now he understood why he had been left behind, why he had been abandoned on Earth for so long. He had been left to live a life of ignorance, to forget his true purpose, to believe he was nothing more than a man. But they had underestimated him. The time for his awakening had come, and with it, the realization that he was not just a soldier. He was the ultimate soldier. He had been designed to fight in battles that would reshape the galaxy to become the weapon that no one had ever seen coming. And as the memories continued to flood his mind, Jonathan realized that he was no longer bound by the life he had lived. He was no longer just a man who studied history and dreamed of a peaceful world. He was a product of war, a creation of a race that had seen potential in him and had shaped him into something far greater than any of them had realized. They had abandoned him. They had left him on Earth thinking that he would remain a forgotten relic, but now he understood they had made a terrible mistake, because he was not forgotten. He was not weak. He was far stronger than they could ever have imagined. And now that strength was awakening inside of him, like a tidal wave ready to crash and wash everything away. Jonathan knew that he had a purpose, one that was far greater than anything he had ever dreamed of. The man he had once been was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, something that would change the course of history, something that would leave its mark on the galaxy. He was no longer just Jonathan Reed. He was Subject E7R31D, a biological weapon designed for destruction and survival. And now that he had begun to understand the full extent of what he was created to do, there was no turning back, no going back to the life he once knew, the life of a scholar, of a teacher. Those days were over, and as the memories continued to return to him, Jonathan felt the full weight of his new reality. He was a soldier, weapon in a war that was already in motion, and he was ready to take his place in it. The power inside of him had been unlocked, and now there was nothing standing in his way. Nothing could stop him from fulfilling the purpose for which he had been created. He had been abandoned because they feared him. They feared what he was capable of. But now he understood that it was not just fear that they had felt. It was the realization that they had created something that no one could control, no one could stop. And as the last of the memories flooded his mind, Jonathan knew that his destiny had already been set. There was no escaping it, no denying it. He was a weapon, and the galaxy would soon know exactly what that meant. Jonathan had always believed that humanity was weak compared to the vastness of the galaxy. But now, as the pieces of his true purpose began to fall into place, he understood how wrong he had been. It was not weakness that defined humanity. It was strength. The ability to adapt, survive, and conquer in ways no other species in the galaxy could comprehend. The memories that had once seemed like fleeting dreams were now becoming a reality. The battles, the war, the enemies he had fought, the victories, won, all of it was encoded within him, like a program waiting to be activated. He wasn't just a man from Earth. He wasn't just Jonathan Reed, a scholar, a teacher. He was something far more dangerous, something far more powerful. He was the weapon that no one had expected humanity to ever produce, the ultimate soldier, forged from the very DNA of the universe's greatest designs, a product of war and destruction, built for one singular purpose: to fight, to win, to survive, and to ensure that humanity would no longer be underestimated by anyone, not by the alien forces who had once looked down upon them, not by the galactic powers who thought humanity would always be a backwater species, easily overlooked, dismissed, and ignored. Jonathan now understood that the very things that made humans appear weak were, in fact, the traits that made them formidable. The ability to endure, the ability to adapt, the relentless drive to survive, no matter the odds. This was what he had been designed to embody. what he was created to represent the fury and resilience of humanity. And now he could feel the power inside of him, awakening each memory. Each flash of a battle fought on alien worlds where humanity had been crushed by enemies far more advanced than them, only to rise again and defeat them, felt like a part of him coming alive, like every cell in his body was remembering its true purpose. Remembering that humanity was not just a race of fragile beings struggling to survive in the universe. They were a force to be reckoned with, a force that would never bow down or be defeated no matter what came their way. As the memories continued to flood his mind, Jonathan began to see the galaxy differently. He saw it not as a vast cold place full of indifferent civilizations, but as a battleground full of opportunities to prove humanity's strength, to show that even the weakest among them could rise up and crush their enemies when they were pushed too far. The universe had made the mistake of thinking humans were weak, and that mistake would cost them everything. Because Jonathan understood now that humanity's greatest strength was not in their technology or their military might. It was in their ability to fight with everything they had, to never give up, to find ways to survive where others would perish, to always rise again even when it seemed impossible. Humanity had a fire in them, a fire that burned brighter the more it was stoked, the more they were oppressed, the more they fought back. And now Jonathan was becoming the living embodiment of that power, of that resilience. He could feel it in every fiber of his being. Every memory, every battle was teaching him more about the potential that had been locked inside of him for so long. And with each passing day, he became more and more like the soldier he was meant to be. No longer just a man, but a weapon forged from humanity's greatest strengths. He knew now what he was meant to do. He was not meant to live a life of peace or quiet study. He was meant to fight to protect his people, to lead them into a new age of power and dominance in the galaxy. And he would stop at nothing to make them realize the true strength of humanity. Nothing would stand in his way. Not the alien forces that had once dismissed them, not the galactic empires that had tried to subjugate them, and certainly not the forces that had created him. Because Jonathan Reed was no longer just a man from Earth. He was Subject E7 R31D, the weapon of humanity's future. And he was ready to unleash the full fury of that future upon anyone who dared to stand against him. The universe would remember humanity. They would remember the name Jonathan Reed, not as a scholar, not as a man, but as the force that changed the course of galactic history, the living embodiment of humanity's power and resilience. And no matter how far the galaxy had gone or how many advanced species they encountered, they would soon learn that no one underestimated humanity ever again. Because Jonathan understood now that the true weapon of humanity was not their technology, not their weapons, but their will to survive and conquer against all odds. And that was something that no enemy in the galaxy could ever match. As the realization set in, Jonathan began to understand the weight of the task before him. This was his destiny, and it was one he would not shy away from. He had been created for this purpose, and it was time to fulfill it. The galaxy would know the strength of humanity. They would learn what it meant to underestimate a species that had the ability to rise from nothing and take what was rightfully theirs. Jonathan's journey was just beginning, but the power that had always been within him was now fully awakened, and he would not stop until he had completed the mission that had been laid out for him. There would be no turning back. The galaxy would tremble at the power of humanity's soldier, the weapon they had created and abandoned, but would now rise to claim his place in the universe. The universe would soon learn what it meant to challenge humanity, and they would pay the price for underestimating its strength. Jonathan stood in the dimly lit room, feeling the weight of the truth crushing him. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about his past, was a lie. The man he had once believed himself to be was nothing but a carefully constructed illusion, a mask created to hide the truth buried deep inside of him. His entire life, all his dreams and desires, had been based on lies. He had been told he was a scholar, a man of intellect and purpose. But the truth was that he had been created for something much darker, much more dangerous. As the memories began to flood back, his mind raced to make sense of them. But there was no denying the inevitable. Jonathan Reed was not just a man. He was a weapon, a biological soldier created for war and destruction. The fragments of his past, the flashes of combat, the war-torn landscapes were all starting to make sense. They were not dreams. They were memories. Memories of a life he had lived before. A life that had been buried beneath the surface of his consciousness, waiting to be awakened. He was no longer just Jonathan Reed, the man who studied ancient texts and taught others about the past. He was Subject E7R31D, a creation designed to be the ultimate soldier. A weapon capable of defeating enemies with unmatched strength, speed, and precision. His body had been altered, his DNA modified, and his mind had been shaped into a machine of war. The more Jonathan remembered, the more terrifying the truth became. His body had been engineered for combat. Every muscle, every cell, every nerve had been fine-tuned to survive in the most hostile environments and to defeat enemies in ways that no human could. He had been designed to fight in wars beyond his comprehension, to be a force that could conquer entire civilizations if necessary. And yet they had abandoned him, left him to live out a life of ignorance on a planet that had no idea of the power that resided within him. The creators who had designed him had thought that by isolating him, by leaving him on Earth, they could control him, that they could bury the truth of what he was and what he could become. But they were wrong. As the memories came flooding back, Jonathan realized that he was not a weapon to be controlled, but a force to be reckoned with. They had underestimated him, believing that he would never remember what he had been created for. But now, as the power within him began to awaken, Jonathan knew that there was no turning back. His life had been a lie. His identity had been stolen, and now he was ready to take control of his own fate. Every day, as the memories resurfaced, he could feel the power within him growing stronger, more focused. The fear he once felt was now replaced with a quiet understanding of what he was capable of. He was not just a man, he was a product of war, a soldier whose only purpose was to fight and survive. The realization that he was more than human, more than what he had believed himself to be, was both liberating and terrifying. He was a weapon, but he was also something more. He was humanity's greatest creation, a being designed to lead the charge in a war that would reshape the galaxy. He had been abandoned because he was too dangerous, too powerful, to be allowed to live among people who couldn't understand what he was. But now Jonathan knew that the very thing that made him a weapon, the thing that had been hidden from him for so long, was the key to his survival. The strength he had was not just physical. It was mental, emotional, and spiritual. He was a being of pure willpower, a force of nature capable of overcoming anything in his path. The more he embraced this power, the more he realized that he was not just a weapon. He was a leader, a force that could bring about change in the galaxy. The world he had once known, the life he had thought he would live, was gone. He could never go back to being the man who studied history and hoped for peace. That life had been a lie, a distraction from the truth of who he really was. He had been created to lead, to fight, and to conquer, not to sit idly by and study the past. The truth of who he was, the truth of his purpose, was now undeniable. And with this truth came an overwhelming sense of power, a power that he could no longer ignore. He had been abandoned, left to live a life of falsehoods, but now that he knew who he truly was, he would make sure that no one ever underestimated him again. The galaxy would soon realize that they had made a grave mistake by abandoning him, by thinking that he was no more than a product of their failed experiments. Jonathan was no longer just a man. He was a force that would change the galaxy. No longer would he be a pawn in the hands of those who sought to control him. He was Subject E7R31D, a living weapon, a leader, and a symbol of humanity's strength. And with this realization came the certainty that his destiny was his own, to shape, to command. The time for his awakening had come, and nothing could stand in his way. Jonathan would rise from the ashes of his former self, leaving behind the man who had once been afraid, the man who had once been lost in the labyrinth of false memories. He would no longer hide from who he truly was. He would embrace it, and with that embrace, he would reshape the galaxy according to his will. The journey ahead would not be easy. He would face enemies that would seek to destroy him, forces that would try to stop him at every turn. But Jonathan understood now that the power within him, the power of his true purpose, was far greater than anything they could throw at him. He would fight, he would conquer, and in the end, he would be the one standing victorious, the one who proved that humanity was not a species to be overlooked, not a race to be left behind. Humanity was a force to be reckoned with, and Jonathan was the weapon that would lead the charge. The battle for the galaxy was just beginning, and he was ready to fight. Jonathan stood in the silent room, staring into the dimly lit corner, as his mind raced with the overwhelming flood of information and memories that had been unlocked. Each moment seemed like an eternity as the realization of his true purpose began to settle in heavy and undeniable. He had always considered himself an ordinary man, a scholar, a teacher, someone whose life was dedicated to the study of ancient languages and civilizations. But now, as the fragments of his past began to fall into place, the truth was inescapable. He was no mere man. He was a weapon, a creation, a tool of war designed for a singular purpose that had been hidden from him for so long. He was Subject E7R31D, a biological soldier, and his existence had been shaped not by the experiences of a human life, but by the directive of beings far beyond humanity's understanding. He had been abandoned, left on Earth, as though he were a forgotten relic of a war that had ended long before his arrival. They had thought they could hide him, that by isolating him from the rest of the universe, they could strip him of his purpose, erase him from the map of galactic history, but they had underestimated him. The more Jonathan uncovered the memories that had been buried deep within him, the more he realized the depth of his capabilities and the true scale of what he was designed to be. The battles he had fought in his past lives, the victories and defeats were all part of a plan, a design, a creation that was meant to transcend time and space. They had thought they could contain him, isolate him, but they had made the gravest of mistakes. As the memories flooded him, Jonathan could feel the power within his own body, awakening, unlocking the very essence of his being. His senses sharpened, his mind cleared, and the physical transformation that had started long ago surged forward with unstoppable force. It wasn't just his body that had been altered. His very DNA had been programmed with the skills of a warrior, the instincts of a soldier, honed for survival in conditions that would break any ordinary human. He was no longer a passive participant in life. He was a tool of war, a soldier who had been bred for one purpose alone: to fight, to survive, and to conquer. But even as the power surged through him, Jonathan could not ignore the fear that gripped his heart, the fear of what he had become, the fear of losing himself, of becoming nothing more than a machine, a tool with no will of his own. The man he had been, the person he had tried so hard to be, was slipping away with every passing moment. And yet, as much as he feared it, he knew there was no turning back. He was already too far gone, too deep into the transformation to escape it. He had been created for this. The fear that once held him back now fueled his drive. It was not the fear of losing control, but the fear of what would happen if he allowed himself to stop. He understood now that he could no longer be the person he had been. Jonathan Reed, the scholar, the man who had dreamed of peace, was gone. He had been replaced by Subject E7R31D, the ultimate soldier, a weapon of war. His body had been designed for this. His mind had been conditioned for this, and now he was awakening to the reality of what he had been created to do. The power inside of him was not just a result of training, but a culmination of years of genetic manipulation and artificial evolution meant to make him the perfect weapon. They had left him behind. They had abandoned him, thinking he would remain dormant, a forgotten tool in the vastness of the universe. But now that he had begun to remember, he knew that he was far more than a forgotten relic. He was the future, and the galaxy would soon realize the magnitude of their mistake. He had been created to lead to fight and to destroy, not just for a war, but for a cause greater than himself. The realization hit him hard. He wasn't just a weapon to be used and discarded. He was a force, a living embodiment of humanity's potential to rise above the constraints that had been placed upon them. They had thought they could keep him hidden, thought they could control him by burying his purpose by keeping him in the dark. But they had failed. Jonathan's awakening was inevitable. And now that it had begun, there was no stopping it. He could feel the echoes of the war he had been created for pulsing through him, the bloodshed, the battles the soldiers who had fought beside him in a war that had never truly ended. He was not just a tool for war. He was the harbinger of a new era, an era where humanity would no longer be the weak, forgotten species that had once been dismissed by the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. They would see humanity's true strength, and Jonathan would be the one to show them. His training had been completed long ago. His transformation was all but finished. Now it was time to act. The memories of the past, the knowledge of the battles he had fought, were now part of him. He was not just a man with a vague sense of purpose. He was a soldier with a mission to reclaim what was rightfully humanity's, to prove that they were not to be overlooked, not to be forgotten. The very thing that had made him a weapon had now become his greatest asset. The fear, the rage, the desire to protect those who had created him. These were no longer weaknesses. They were the sources of his power, the things that would drive him forward, the forces that would propel him into the future. Jonathan knew that he would have to face the consequences of what he was becoming, but he also knew that the galaxy had no idea what was coming for them. They would soon understand that they had created something they could not control, something far more dangerous than they could have ever anticipated. The soldiers of the galaxy would tremble at the power of humanity's greatest weapon, and Jonathan, as he stood on the threshold of his new reality, understood that there was no turning back. The truth had been revealed. The past had been unlocked, and now he would take his place among the stars as humanity's true champion. There would be no more hiding, no more pretending. The time for change had come, and Jonathan Reed, Subject E7R31D, was the one who would lead it. Jonathan stood in the center of the room, feeling the weight of the truth slowly settle in every fiber of his being. Everything he had believed about himself, everything he thought he knew, was slowly shattering before his eyes. The man he thought he was, the life he thought he lived, were nothing but illusions. He was not just a man. He was not simply Jonathan Reed, the scholar and teacher. He had always identified himself as no, he was something far more than that, something far more dangerous, and something that had been hidden from him for so long. He was a product of something beyond his comprehension, a creation designed for a singular purpose, a weapon of unimaginable power that had been embedded within his very DNA. And now, that truth was awakening, crashing into him. With the force of a tidal wave, he could feel the memories, fragments of lives he had never lived, flooding his consciousness, pushing their way through the barriers his mind had placed on them. They were not just memories. They were experiences that were implanted into him, encoded deep within his cells, ready to emerge when the time was right. They were the echoes of battles fought on worlds that were not his own wars, waged against enemies that he could not remember. But now the clarity was coming. His body responded to these memories like it had always known what to do, like it had been designed for this very moment. The sharpness of his senses, the quickness of his reflexes, the power coursing through him, all of it was becoming too much to ignore. He was not just Jonathan Reed, a man who had studied history and dreamed of peace. He was a weapon, a soldier who had been forged for war, a living instrument of destruction. The fear that had once gripped him, the fear of losing himself, of becoming something he couldn't control, was now replaced by something else, something stronger, something more primal. The fear of what he was becoming faded into the background as his new reality settled in. He was not an ordinary human. He never had been, and now he understood why his existence was not the result of random chance. but the deliberate design of forces far beyond human understanding. They had left him here isolated on Earth, believing that by burying him in this far-off corner of the universe, they could erase him. They thought they could contain him, control him, but they had made the mistake of thinking he was just a forgotten relic of a failed project. They had underestimated him. Jonathan had been left to live a life of obscurity, of misdirection, believing he was just a man with a penchant for studying languages and history. But now the truth was undeniable. He was Subject E7R31D, a biological weapon created for the sole purpose of war. And now that the memories had started to resurface, now that he had begun to see the full scope of what he was capable of, there was no going back. His mind, his body, and his very essence were being reshaped, transformed into something far beyond what he had ever imagined. As the memories continued to flood his consciousness, he could see flashes of alien worlds, of fleets, of ships clashing in space, of battles fought with advanced technologies that humanity could only dream of. These were not just dreams. These were fragments of a reality that had been buried deep within him, and now they were coming to the surface, overwhelming him with the knowledge of his true purpose. Jonathan felt his body change in ways he couldn't explain. His muscles, once weak from years of normal human life, were now growing stronger, more defined, as though they were being rebuilt from the inside out. His reflexes were sharper, his senses more acute, and his mind clearer, more focused. It was as though everything about him was being reprogrammed, aligning with the purpose he had been designed for. The power that had been dormant within him was now awakening, and there was no turning back from it. But it wasn't just the physical transformation that terrified him. It was the psychological and emotional changes. He could feel the warrior inside of him awakening as well. The part of him that had been created to fight, to destroy, to conquer. He had always believed he was a man of peace, a scholar who sought to understand the past. But now he could no longer deny the truth. He had been created for war, and war was all he knew. As the memories of his battles continued to surface, he began to understand the true purpose behind his creation. He wasn't just a tool of destruction. He was the key to humanity's survival, the ultimate weapon that had been designed to ensure that humanity could survive in the harshest conditions the galaxy could throw at them. The enemies he had been created to fight, the battles he had been created to win, were all part of a greater plan. A plan that no one had told him about, but that he was now beginning to see for himself. They had left him behind, thinking he was just a failed experiment, a relic of a past they no longer cared about. But now Jonathan realized that they had made a grave mistake. He was not forgotten. He was not a failure, and he would show them that. As his memories continued to flood his mind, Jonathan began to see his true purpose more clearly. He was not just a man created for war. He was a man who was born to lead, to fight, and to protect his people. The power inside of him was not just for destruction, but for creation as well. He had been created to ensure that humanity would never be seen as weak again, that they would never be overlooked, that they would rise to their rightful place in the galaxy. And now he had the power to make that happen. The truth about who he was and why he had been created was finally clear. And with that truth came the realization that he could never go back to the life he had known. The man who had once been Jonathan Reed was gone. He had been replaced by something far greater, far more dangerous, and now he was ready to fulfill his purpose. The memories of battles, of victories and defeats flooded his mind as he embraced the power within him. He was no longer afraid. He was no longer the man who had been left behind. He was Subject E7R31D, and the galaxy would soon know his name. They would soon understand that humanity was not a race to be forgotten, not a race to be dismissed. Humanity was a force to be reckoned with, and Jonathan was the living embodiment of that force. He was no longer just a man, he was a weapon, and now he would fulfill the purpose he had been created for. There would be no turning back. The power inside him would not be denied. The galaxy would soon learn that underestimating humanity had been their greatest mistake. Jonathan was coming, and with him came the reckoning. He would fight, and he would conquer, and humanity would rise with him stronger than ever before.